Okay, good evening, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, good night, maybe, wherever you are in the world. Here in England, it's a very blustery but sunny day, very extreme weather, and hope you're all in a good frame of mind and you've been negotiating the challenge of the last few weeks of the lockdown and the coronavirus situation. So in case you haven't realized already, I am Steve Taylor. I am a transpersonal psychologist, which means basically a spiritual psychologist. And I'm also a poet. I write books on psychology and spirituality. And I've been invited to speak today about my research into spiritual awakening and into transformational experiences. So I'm going to share some of my findings and some of my experiences and some of my insights, and some of my conclusions. And I think I'm going to speak for maybe half an hour or so. Is that right, Joe? And then we'll have time for discussions and questions. So I think it's first of all, I want to say that when we investigate spirituality or when we do research into spirituality, I've always thought that it's very important that we ground that research in our own experiences. Because I've been to so many workshops and seminars about spirituality where it's obvious that nobody actually knows anything about spirituality in an experiential, affective sense. They know about spirituality in an intellectual sense. So, you know, many academic conferences, people speak about spirituality in a very dry and abstract way. And they're missing the kind of heart or the experiential element. I remember one conference about 5 years ago in London. It was like a one-day workshop on the understanding of spirituality. But I thought, you know, the best thing to do would be to meditate all day, or maybe to do some yoga or Tai Chi. But, you know, it was all lectures and seminars in a very intellectual way. I remember one of the questions that we had to discuss in our groups was, see if you can make any sense of this question. The question was, how other does the other have to be before it becomes spiritual? Think about that. How other does the other have to be before it becomes spiritual? And I just thought that was complete nonsense. And it is complete nonsense. But of course, everybody sat around and tried to find some sense in it and came to some conclusions. But so that's why it's so important to really experience the issues and the ideas you talk about. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own spirituality and my own background in spiritual experiences. And for me, that began when I was about 16 years old. That was when I began to have my first spiritual experiences. I actually prefer the term awakening experiences, as you know if you've read any of my books. I prefer the term awakening experiences, partly because the term spiritual has so many different meanings to different people. And awakening experiences suggest an opening of awareness. They suggest an expansion and an intensification of awareness, which is what these experiences are essentially about. So I started to have these experiences when I was about 16. And at that time, I was actually very unhappy. I was very depressed and alienated, without really knowing why. I mean, my childhood was quite happy. I was a very happy child. My parents were very loving and attentive. My background was very stable. But something changed internally when I was about 15 or 16, and I became a completely different person. I felt like I became a completely different person. I didn't know how to function in the world. I didn't know how to talk to people. I didn't know how to behave. And I became incredibly quiet. I rarely spoke because I just didn't know how to speak to people anymore. And I spent most of my time alone in my room because I didn't know how to behave with other people. So the safest thing was to be alone. I only felt comfortable when I was alone. And I felt as though I didn't fit in. I didn't know who I was. I didn't fit in. I wasn't the person my parents expected me to be. So I felt extremely depressed and alienated. I thought about committing suicide quite a lot. But occasionally, in the midst of this depression, I'd have these moments of euphoria. I'd have these moments of liberation when it felt as if I was connected to my surroundings. I felt as though the world around me came to life. It became incredibly real and beautiful and vivid. And my being seemed to spread out of my mind and body into the space around me. And I felt in some way, I was one with the trees or the sky or the fields around me. So it was usually when I was in natural surroundings, maybe walking through the park or walking through my school fields. I used to go back to my school in the evening to walk around the fields. And, these moments they helped to keep me going in the midst of my depression and alienation. But it was only a few years ago that it occurred to me that these experiences of connection and euphoria and meaning, that maybe they were in some way generated by the depression I felt most of the time. And it seemed to be, it was often the moments when I felt most low, when I felt at my lowest, when I felt most desperate and most isolated. That was when these moments of expansion would occur, these moments of meaning and harmony. But in some way, these experiences, they made me more confused because they seemed to provide more evidence that I was abnormal. I wanted to be normal, but I couldn't be normal. I felt like I was a misfit, some kind of like tortured artist figure who was destined to die in misery and suffering. So for a long time, I felt even more confused because of these experiences. I didn't try to speak to them about anybody. I certainly didn't try to talk to my parents about them because they thought I was crazy enough already. They would definitely have sent me to see a psychiatrist. So it was only when I was about 22 years old when I discovered a book on mysticism. It was actually a book called Mysticism, A Study and an Anthology by an author called F.C. Happold. And I found this book in a bookshop. When I read it, I felt this marvelous sense of coming home, a marvelous sense of self-understanding and self-acceptance, because I realized that the experiences I'd been having were similar to the experiences of the mystics in this book, the same sense of illumination and expansion and oneness. So I started to have a framework to make sense of my experiences. I began to read books on spirituality. I gravitated towards spiritual groups. I learned to meditate. I learned to do Qigong and so on. So I had a context to make sense. So I felt a marvelous sense of self-acceptance, finally. So I realized that I wasn't crazy after all. Or maybe I was crazy, but all of these other people were crazy too. So that was, at least I wasn't alone in my craziness. And so, I had a few more difficulties over the years. I had to go through a process of integrating my spiritual awareness into everyday life. And I had to learn to function in the everyday world, which was quite difficult for a number of years. But eventually, by my late 20s, the age of 28, 29, I think somebody needs to be on mute. Somebody's yawning and coughing, which isn't good for my self-esteem as a speaker.
Sorry, Steve.
No, I'm joking. But yeah, seriously, maybe you could put yourself on mute until the discussion in half an hour or so. So, so by the age of 28, 29, I felt I was on an even keel. I understood myself. I was able to function in the everyday world. I was able to work and speak to other people in a functional way. And at that time, I decided that I wanted to understand my own spiritual experiences in an academic context. So I decided to go to university to do a master's degree in transpersonal psychology, mainly because I wanted to understand awakening experiences. I wanted to find out how common they were in other people. I wanted to find out whether they were accidental or whether they were related to certain situations or certain triggers or activities. So that was the first thing I did as a psychologist. Once I got my PhD, I began to study awakening experiences. I collected reports of awakening experiences to try to find out the situations in which they occurred. I collected as many examples of spiritual experiences when people's awareness expands and intensifies as I could. And I'll show you now, I'll show you some of my findings if I can work out how to do this. Here we go. Hopefully this will work. So yeah, can you see my slide there? Yep, good. I'll just see if I can change it to play from start. Yeah, here we go. So here you can see a study I conducted with a co-researcher called Christina Igato-Svabo. This was published 3 years ago in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. And in this study, we collected 90 examples of awakening experiences, 90 reports of awakening experiences, and we analyzed them to try and find out what situations they arose in. What were the triggers of these awakening experiences? And we found, to my surprise, that the most significant trigger was psychological turmoil. 37 out of 90 experiences, some of them had more than one trigger, were connected to psychological turmoil, stress, depression, loss, bereavement, and so on. And that was when it occurred to me that my own experiences may have been related to psychological turmoil. And so that's over a third of the experiences were connected to psychological turmoil. Other triggers were more expected, like nature was a big trigger of these experiences, spiritual practice, spiritual literature also. Not too many with psychedelics. We were surprised that not too many reports featured psychedelics, only 3 out of 90. Well, I guess, out of the general population, these experiences were from the general population. In the general population, not too many people take psychedelics. Unfortunately, maybe it'd be better if more people did take psychedelics. Hopefully my children don't watch this video. But not now, maybe later, maybe in about 10 years when they're old enough to understand psychedelics. But yeah, so obviously psychedelics are a significant trigger of awakening experiences, but not so many people in the general population take them. So let me just give you a couple of examples. This is one example of an awakening experience induced by intense psychological turmoil. And I found quite a few examples in combat situations from soldiers. And this was a soldier who reported, well, an ex-soldier who reported an experience in the Vietnam War in 1969, I think this was. So this is how he describes it. With casualties mounting, I was in a state of high anxiety, and I figured there was no way I would live through this seemingly endless battle. At one point, after carrying yet another severely wounded Marine to a waiting chopper, something happened to me. It's actually indescribable, but I'll make a feeble attempt to do so. I opened up literally from my perspective. I came out of myself. I expanded infinitely. I disappeared. It didn't last long, but it was the most powerful experience I've ever had. And for this gentleman, he told me that this experience opened up a new life for him. When he returned to America after the war, he was a spiritual seeker. He wanted to recapture this experience, and he realized that it was connected to spirituality. So he began to meditate. He investigated Buddhism and other spiritual traditions, because he knew intuitively that that was where he could find this experience again. Well, unfortunately, he told me that he'd never been able to recapture this experience in the same intensity, even though he'd had glimpses of a similar experience at a less intense degree. So I guess this is an example of how a situation of intense stress and also maybe an encounter with death, when your life is in danger, how that can bring about a sudden shift into a different state of being. So let me give you another example. This was actually a young woman who was suffering from severe depression. She had actually attempted suicide and she was in hospital following her suicide attempt. And she woke up one morning. I'm not sure if it was the next morning. It may have been the next morning after her suicide attempt, or maybe the 2 mornings later. But she woke up and there was, on the bedside table in a hospital, there was a marble. She didn't know how it had got there. There was a marble on the bedside table. So she picked up this marble and suddenly she shifted into this different state of being. And this is how she described it. I saw reality as simply this perfect oneness. I felt suddenly removed from everything that was personal. Everything seemed just right. All my problems and my suffering suddenly seemed meaningless, ridiculous, simply a misunderstanding of my true nature and everything around me. There was a feeling of acceptance and oneness. It was a moment of enlightenment. The euphoria and inexplicable rush of knowledge and understanding following this episode lasted for days. So these experiences seem paradoxical, you know, in the sense that you shift from a state of suicidal depression into a state of liberation and euphoria. But maybe it shows that, you know, states of extreme emotion are not really dualistic. They're not really opposed. In some way, they are closely intertwined. And even though this experience was temporary, you know, obviously when we talk about awakening experiences, we're talking about temporary experiences that fade away after a certain amount of time. Nevertheless, this experience changed her. It made her feel more positive about the world. It gave her a sense that she could overcome her problems. It gave her a new sense of trust in life and trust in the world. So as a result, she began to feel much more positive about life and began to transcend her severe depression. So yes, these experiences seem paradoxical, but I think maybe we can understand them in terms of ego dissolution, in terms of the dissolving away of the ego, our normal sense of identity. Let me see if I can share myself again. I'll just stop share for a second. So as I said, I think these experiences can be understood in terms of ego dissolution. Our normal sense of identity dissolves away. I think the state of suffering becomes so intense that there is a collapse, just like in the same way that a building collapses in an earthquake. You know, in states of intense stress and suffering, the normal ego, the normal self system collapses. And there's suddenly a loss of boundaries. There's suddenly a freedom from the anxieties of the ego, from the problems associated with the ego. And I think that accounts for the sudden sense of freedom and the sudden sense of connection in these experiences. But what seems to happen is that the normal ego rebuilds itself after a while, which is why these experiences are temporary. But even then, there's something remains of these experiences. As I said before, there's a sense of optimism, a sense of positivity, a new sense of hope. Partly because people know that this world of intense meaning, this world of liberation, freedom, they know it's there, even if they may not have direct access to it. So after I'd studied awakening experiences, I began to look into permanent awakening experiences, permanent wakefulness, as I call it. Situations where people shift into a permanent sense of new identity. And I call that wakefulness. When awakening experiences are not temporary, they become an ongoing, stable state of wakefulness. And I think wakefulness as an ongoing state is much more common than most people realize. Partly because a lot of the people who experience it don't have a background in spirituality. and they don't really interpret what's happened to them in spiritual terms. Maybe later on they stumble on or they gravitate towards spiritual ideas and they recognize that, hey, yeah, that's what happened to me. But initially, at least, they don't explain what's happened to them in spiritual terms. And usually a shift into wakefulness occurs just like awakening experiences in states of intense turmoil and stress. And the first person I encountered who'd had this kind of experience was a man who I called the laundrette guru. I think if you're in America, you don't call them laundrettes, you call them, I can't remember what you call them. I'm not sure. It's a place where you wash your laundry anyway. In England, we call them laundrettes. Anyway, a friend of mine said to me,
laundromat.
Laundromat. Right, thank you. Laundromat. Similar to laundrette. Anyway, yeah, a friend of mine said to me, oh, you've got to meet this guy from the local laundrette. You've got to come to the laundrette. He's like a guru. I said, okay. So I went along to the laundrette a couple of days later with my clothes. And yeah, there was a guy there who was 60 years old, a guy called Tony. And as soon as I put my clothes in the machine, he sat down and talked to me. And he told me about this amazing transformation that he'd been through. And it happened when he was about 52, 10 years earlier. He'd been a successful businessman, very materialistic guy with a big house and 3 or 4 cars, working 70 hours a week. But he had a severe heart attack, a cardiac arrest, probably because of the intense stress of his life. And he was in hospital for 2 weeks. And when he woke up after his heart attack, after the operation in hospital, he felt like a different person. He had no idea why, but he felt like a different person with a new identity. He had a new sense of gratitude. He was grateful for the people in his life, his family and his friends. He was grateful for the natural world around him. He felt grateful towards life itself in a way that he had never been before. He realized that previously he had taken life for granted, but now he felt this intense sense of gratitude for everything in his life. And he felt this intense sense of joy in being alive, which he'd never had before. It was almost as if scales had fallen away from his eyes. And he was suddenly looking at life in a clear and vivid way for the first time. He had woken up, basically. This is what we mean by awakening. He had woken up. And he felt this new sense of meaning and connection. So he decided to sell his business, and he bought a laundrette with the money. And he decided he wanted to have a laundrette so that he could speak to the people who came into his laundrette and tell them about his transformation, which he did with me. And the whole of the laundrette was filled with spiritual quotes all over the walls. So it was a great kind of inspiring place where all of the spiritual seekers in the area gravitated towards the laundrette. So he was the first person that I was aware of who'd undergone this transformation in the face of in the face of death, you could say. I think his encounter with death through a heart attack brought about this intense shift. So this is what I call post-traumatic transformation. And I'll just share my screen for a moment just to give you an example of post-traumatic transformation. So maybe you've heard of post-traumatic growth, which is quite a well-known term in psychology, which describes how people undergo personal development following trauma, following difficulties and challenges in their lives. It doesn't really matter what type of trauma it is, but any form of trauma can, in the long term, bring about post-traumatic growth. So what I call post-traumatic transformation is similar, but post-traumatic transformation is much more dramatic and much more deep-rooted than post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic transformation usually occurs in a sudden moment of transformation, in a very unexpected and spontaneous and sudden way. And it usually follows situations such as bereavement, a diagnosis of cancer, addiction, intense stress or depression. And it's almost as if there is a higher functioning self waiting to emerge in certain people, because obviously this doesn't happen to everybody who goes through trauma, but in some people, there seems to be a higher self which is waiting to emerge. It's ready to be born, just like a chick is ready to hatch from an egg. This higher self, it's intact, it's structured, it's integrated, it's ready, and it's just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. And it has the opportunity when the normal ego breaks down following intense stress and suffering. The normal ego breaks down, and suddenly this higher self emerges, just like a phoenix arising from the ashes. And I've come across so many cases of this in my research, but I'll just give you maybe one or two examples. This is the way that some people describe it. It's a new sense of identity which suddenly emerges. You know, it's almost as somebody said, it's almost as if there are two people. And it also becomes permanent. People know that when this new identity emerges inside them, there's no going back. You know, it's permanent. They know that they are a different person and they're not going to change. There's a beautiful quote from one of the people I interviewed here. She said, "The way it feels is that I've permanently broken through to another state. I've moved up to another level of awareness, which I know is going to stay with me. It's like the transformation a caterpillar goes through during the chrysalis stage before emerging as a butterfly." So I love that image of the butterfly emerging from the chrysalis. And here's just one example I'll share with you. This was a lady called Irene Murray, who I interviewed. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer in the year 2000 and told that her cancer was advanced and she may only have 1 year left to live. Her treatment was very intensive. She almost died twice during her treatment. But her post-traumatic transformation occurred almost as soon as she was diagnosed with cancer. And again, it seems paradoxical that as soon as she was told the news that she was going to die, or probably going to die, she underwent this sudden awakening, this sudden liberation. And this is how she described it. This was just the day after she was diagnosed. She said, "It was the first time I'd seen death as a reality and realized that life is just temporary. The following day, I woke up and thought, I'm just so lucky to be alive. The fact that I'm still here. The air was so clean and so fresh, and everything I looked at seemed so vibrant and vivid. The trees were so green, and everything was so alive. I became aware of this energy radiating from trees. I had this tremendous feeling of connectedness." So again, it's almost as if the scales have fallen away from her eyes. It's almost as if literally she has woken up to the world as it really is, as if a veil has fallen away. And I think this is how the world appears without the veil of familiarity, which normally we see the world through. This is, you know, the world as it appears to children because they haven't learned to see the world in a familiar way. And I think just as in Tony's case, as I described earlier, it was connected to the encounter with death. Sometimes an encounter with death is enough to wake us up. It's enough to stop us taking the world for granted. It's enough to enable us to see the world as it really is, rather than through a veil of familiarity. And a lot of people who undergo this transformation, they report a similar phenomenon, which is that it's very intense in the beginning for the first few weeks, and then it begins to settle down. It de-intensifies after a while and settles down at a slightly lower level of intensity, but then it becomes stable, it becomes ongoing, it becomes people's normal state. So Irene described this as, that feeling was really intense for the first few weeks, and it's remained ever since. It just blew me away, it really did. I used to just sit there and think, this is amazing that things could just fall into place very quickly, so quickly. So like a lot of people who undergo this shift, Irene changed the way she lived. She'd been working as a a marketing executive for a pharmaceutical company. So obviously she decided that she couldn't carry on with that job once she'd undergone spiritual awakening. Apologies to anybody who works for a pharmaceutical company. But no, she wanted to do something more direct and more empathetic and more compassionate. So she trained as a therapist. And fortunately, her cancer went into remission. And so she spent the next 13 years living in this higher state, this more intense state. Unfortunately, in 2013, her cancer returned after 13 years and she died. But I spoke to her a few months before she died when her cancer returned. And she said that, even though she was ill, even though she was in danger of death again, she felt incredibly grateful that she'd had the gift of these 13 years in this higher state of awareness, living so authentically, so purposively, and so meaningfully, with such gratitude and such intensity. So recently, I've been investigating cases of post-traumatic transformation in other circumstances. I've done a research study about bereavement, and I found that it's not uncommon for people to undergo this transformation following bereavement. I did a study of 16 people who'd undergone spiritual awakening or post-traumatic transformation after the loss of loved ones. So even when, their loved ones had been lost in very traumatic circumstances, even if it was a murder, or even if a child who died through illness, there was still a possibility of undergoing this shift into an awakened state. I've recently done a study of people who've undergone spiritual awakening following addiction and also incarceration. Now, addiction is really interesting because it's not uncommon. There's a strong connection between addiction and spirituality, which is expressed in the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step process, which is basically a path of spiritual awakening for people who are recovering from addiction. And I found quite a few really remarkable cases of addicts, drug addicts, and alcoholics who really hit the lowest point where they were close to death or where they attempted suicide. And suddenly, without any volition, without any warning or expectation, suddenly there's a shift inside them. And suddenly the addiction drops away in an almost miraculous way. And they become free of the craving for drugs or alcohol. And again, there is this phenomenon of becoming a different person. It's almost as if they're in the same body, but they become a different person inhabiting the same body. One woman I spoke to recently, a recovering alcoholic, she had been an alcoholic for 30 years, and her health had deteriorated, her mental health and physical health had become really severely damaged by alcoholism. And she reached the point where she wanted to commit suicide. And she tried to commit suicide, but didn't manage to. But in the aftermath, she woke up in the aftermath and felt like she was a different person, and as if the urge to drink had suddenly disappeared. And she looked in the mirror and she didn't recognize the person because she suddenly felt she was somebody else in her body. She didn't recognize her own reflection in the mirror. And that's quite a kind of dramatic illustration of how there is a shift in identity in these moments. So before we moved into a discussion, I'd just like to share my own interpretation of these experiences. Why does spiritual awakening occur in these situations of intense turmoil and suffering? Why do people undergo this sudden shift into a different identity in these moments? And I think it's similar to my explanation of temporary awakening experiences. I think what happens is that there is an ego dissolution. The ego dissolves away either because of the intense stress of suffering, like a building collapsing in an earthquake, or maybe it's a long, slow process of loss, a dark night of the soul, as Jerome says there. I think if you take the case of addiction, for example, when a person is an alcoholic or a drug addict, slowly they lose everything which determines their identity. All of their attachments begin to fade away. They lose their, maybe they lose their role in society, lose their jobs, lose their status in their family as a husband or father or mother. They lose their self-respect. They lose their possessions, their status, their success. Everything falls away. And I think of these psychological attachments as the building blocks of the ego. All of these things, they constitute your ego, your role in society, your ambitions for the future, your achievements, your status, your possessions. All of these things are the building blocks of your ego. So when they are taken away from you during a period of intense suffering, your ego collapses, just the way that a house collapses when enough bricks are taken away. The house of your ego collapses because all of these bricks, all of these building blocks are taken away. And in these situations, for some people, there is a latent higher self, as I mentioned earlier, ready to emerge. So as soon as the old ego collapses, this higher self emerges, this latent higher self emerges inside them and takes over as their normal self, as their new self. And that's why, addicts report the phenomenon of suddenly losing their cravings, because the person who was addicted no longer exists. The person who was addicted to drugs or alcohol has dissolved away. And their new identity has no addictions, there's no attachments. So they are suddenly free, and they are suddenly experiencing the world through a new awareness and a new state of being. So one of the big questions here is, everybody goes through intense suffering in their lives at some point. As the Buddha said, life involves suffering. That's one of the four noble truths of Buddhism. But obviously, not so many people undergo this transformation in response to suffering. Maybe only a small proportion. I think it's probably bigger than we realize. I think maybe, 5% or 10% of people undergo this transformation in response to intense suffering. But the question I want to answer, maybe you've got some of your own views on this, maybe we can, discuss some of these things in a moment. But why does it happen to some people but not others? Why do some people undergo this transformation while others just experience the breakdown? They just experience the pain of the breakdown of their ego. I think it's partly because in some people, this higher self is ready to emerge. It's fully formed inside them. It's integrated as a structure. It's just waiting for the opportunity to unravel. I think in other people, it's just not ready. It's just not formed inside them. But I think it's about acceptance and courage as well. It's about having the courage to face up to your suffering and your challenging predicament. When a lot of people undergo suffering in their lives, they divert themselves from it. They don't think about it. Or maybe they don't accept it. They try to push it away. They try to resist it. But I found that this transformation occurs in a mode of acceptance and surrender. It occurs when people stop resisting their predicament. Something gives way and they accept, even if they're facing death through cancer or through an addiction, they accept their predicament. They let go of resistance. And that's when the transformation occurs. Often at the exact moment of acceptance. In Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a stage where people hand over their problem to a higher power. They say, this problem is too big for me to deal with, so I'm going to let go and hand it over to something bigger, and they can deal with it. And sometimes in alcoholics, the transformation occurs right at that moment when they hand over their problem. So I think that mode of acceptance is probably the most essential quality which brings about these transformational experiences. And I do think, just as one final point before we have a discussion, I do think there is something evolutionary about these experiences. I think the higher self, which unravels in these situations, it represents a higher stage of evolution. It represents a higher stage in the unfolding of consciousness. And I think one day it will collectively unfold in the human race as a whole. I think maybe that's happening already. I think slowly this higher self is unfolding in the human race collectively. That's why it happens so frequently. That's why I've always found it so easy to find examples of this transformation, because it's much more common than most people realize. And maybe the situation we're living in at the moment, maybe a situation of crisis, is, maybe that's helping to generate this higher state in more and more people. Maybe even, a collective encounter with death. When we think about concepts such as ecological destruction, maybe even the coronavirus, we're talking about encounters with death. And maybe collectively, the crises we are undergoing, the confrontation with death that we are experiencing, maybe that is collectively having an awakening effect. Okay, thank you very much. So, yeah, let's maybe we can open it up for some questions and some comments now.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Is that Joe?
No, it's Bash.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Hiya. We've not met in person though.
Oh, yeah.
So
I think I recognize your name.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because I'm interested in applying to the masters in interdisciplinary psychology.
Oh yeah.
I talked to one of your colleagues, but that aside, thanks for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I've just got a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I've had my own spiritual awakening, and I can't say that I was grateful for the experience at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I've got a couple of questions. One is like, is awakening able to be studied in an academic sense? Because the experience itself is beyond concepts. And because like Western civilization is built on a positivist tradition, which is basically just measuring things,
Mm-hmm.
is that the right tool to approach something like this? So that's the first question. And the second question is that my awakening brought up a lot of repressed emotional stuff that was painful. And I saw that as a kind of purification process. It was not ostensibly different to the work I was doing on myself before the awakening, which is essentially trying to get rid of repressed emotional stuff. Right. But then when the awakening happened, something else took over, and it just went, it kind of accelerated massively.
Okay.
And I'm starting to feel more settled now. But I just wondered what your thoughts were about it as a kind of a purification process. There's two questions there. One is,
okay.
can it be studied, and is this part of a purification process, which ties into your idea that it's an evolutionary process in terms of evolution of consciousness? So I just wondered if that made any sense.
So as for the first question, well, as I've been studying it for 10 years now, I obviously think it can be studied. Otherwise, I've been wasting my time.
Yeah, that's not quite what I meant.
I know what you mean.
All right, you know what I mean, yeah. Okay.
Well, first of all, there are degrees of awakening. There are degrees of wakefulness. So people sometimes say, as you said, that it's, you can't conceive of it, you can't conceptualize it because it's beyond concepts, it's beyond structures of language, it's beyond duality. And that's true. But that probably only applies to the highest levels of wakefulness. There are lots of degrees of awakening. where people do manage to describe their experiences very well. You know, I've collected many examples of awakening experiences where people do manage to convey their experiences very beautifully and accurately in language. It's really when you get to the sort of highest levels of awakening where language begins to fail. But even there, I think you can, you know, I mean, poets do this, and this is why there is such a strong connection between poetry and spirituality. Because even though these experiences are difficult to convey in normal language, you can convey them more subtly through analogies, metaphors, the use of language in a poetic way, even through music. You know, so I think you can convey them, and I think you can study them too. You know, some people would say that you can study spirituality in a positivistic sense. You know, if you use, for example, brain scanning, you could do brain scans of people who are having meditative experiences. And that's true to an extent. You can look at the parts of the brain which are involved in intense, deep states of meditation. But I mean, my approach is qualitative. We call it qualitative in psychology. When you study experiences, you collect examples of people's experiences, you interview them in as much detail as possible, and then you analyze experiences and look for themes that occur. So that's science. It's just a different kind of science. It's not positivistic science. So in that sense, yeah, I think you can understand them. You can study them.
Yeah.
And there's the second question. Yeah, a lot of people experience this, that when they have an awakening, a lot of repressed material arises inside them. I think that's simply because when you undergo an awakening, the boundaries of the ego dissolve away. That's why you have an intense perception. That's why you have an intense experience of connection to other people and to the world around you, to nature and so on. But also within you, the boundaries of your ego, which protect you from your unconscious mind, your superconscious mind, they fall away as well. So suddenly a lot of material which is normally repressed rises to the surface. Just like when a wall breaks down, suddenly the wall of a dam, when a dam breaks down, suddenly there's a flow of water. So in spiritual awakening, there's a sudden flow of repressed material. And that's one of the reasons why spiritual awakening can be, you know, a very disturbing process.
Yeah.
That's why it can be a spiritual crisis.
Yeah. Could I also just ask you as well, is that in Western societies, which are not terribly supportive of this process, that I know I've had some training in the mental health field, and I know that this kind of experience can be viewed as psychotic.
Yeah.
And that's a danger, I think, because there's not enough support for people. Because you've mentioned also in your presentations that this can just drop on someone's head out of the big deep blue, out of nowhere, and people have never meditated a day in their life. And then once the danger is, if they then get into the mental health system, they can get prescribed some pretty powerful drugs that will shut the experience down.
You've come to the right place, really. You know, the Radical Culture Organization, this is one of the areas they focus on. And the whole area, it's related to the whole area of spiritual crisis, and they overlap between psychosis and spiritual awakening. My own feeling is that a lot of people who undergo spiritual awakening are misdiagnosed with psychosis, and they are unnecessarily and possibly detrimentally given medication or even sectioned. I think there are probably thousands of spiritually awakening people who are being dosed up on medication or even sectioned. But I think most people undergo this experience. They know that they are undergoing a positive transformation experience. They know that it's not really a totally psychotic, disruptive experience. So often they have the sense to, you know,
there is a kind of a death experience, though.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of what I went through. There's a feeling of psychological death, but you don't actually die. You transform it, and the fear, a lot of it is fear of the unknown. That's how it was for
me.
You know,
maybe in a sense you do die, but something else is born inside you to replace the ego which dies. Well, let's go to, thanks, Bash. Should we go to
Thanks a lot.
a few of the people who've got their hands up? Jorge? Are you there, Jorge?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to make a comment?
Yes. Steve, what an honor, what a pleasure, how grateful I am to share this space with you and with this community from the bottom of my heart. I want to make this comment. And a question actually. Your contribution for me is terribly important, and let me explain it why. Because I first read you intellectually. Okay, I am a college professor, and it was thrilling. It was so illuminating. You know, reading your books of research. I am a political economist by training, so I know what research is about. So it opened a path, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Which no way can be compared, Steve, with the path you opened by your poetry, especially the Kant Center. Okay, so it is like the experience of embracing two ways of knowing, which in the first one in which I connected very much intellectually, but the second one, I'm speaking from the bottom of my heart, reading the Kant Center, it opened something within me to deeper, it made me dive to deeper layers, okay?
Yeah.
Just as a way of introduction, Steve, my question is the following. I have, as I'm sure everybody here, our tremendous episodes of suffering. I have suffered a lot in my life, okay? And probably, my dear Steve, I am one of those who did not have that courage to lean into the suffering, but to try to avoid the suffering, okay? So my question is that if in your research, in your own journey, have you met, Steve, people who have not been awakened to suffering as a result of suffering, but are nevertheless awakened? Nevertheless, they have these traits of being awakened, but that they did not went to that threshold through the dark night of the soul.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jorge, first of all, for your comments. Glad that my poetry had such great effects on you.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a new book of poetry coming out later this year. It's called The Clear Light.
We're getting a storm.
You got a storm?
I hear thunder and we're getting a storm. I have to go put the lawnmower in the shed.
Oh, right. The stormy search for the self.
Sure.
Yeah, so but as for your question, yeah, I mean, even though I have spoken a lot about the connection between spiritual awakening and suffering, it's not the only way in which spiritual awakening can occur. Some people are just naturally awakened. I talk about this in my book, The Leap, that there are three ways in which awakening can occur. Some people are just naturally awake. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to follow any spiritual practices. They don't need to go through a traumatic experience. It's just their natural state of being, which they don't need to cultivate. I think most people often become poets or artists. Sometimes they become social activists because they have a strong sense of compassion and a strong mission to help other human beings. But secondly, a lot of people undergo a gradual spiritual awakening through, well, either consciously through spiritual practices or unconsciously through a certain way of life that they lead. I once met a woman who told me that she had become spiritually awakened as a result of being an air stewardess for 25 years. It sounds a little bit crazy, but she said that if you are an air stewardess, it's a life of complete service. You give your complete attention to other people. You're constantly serving other people in your role. So it's a combination of mindfulness and service. So I think the combination of mindfulness and service over many, many years can lead to spiritual awakening, a gradual spiritual awakening. I've met a person who worked as a groom for horses for many years. And he said that in retrospect, the years he spent grooming, caring for horses was a kind of mindfulness and a kind of service, which led to his awakening.
Russell Williams.
Russell Williams, that's the guy.
Yeah, I've read the book also.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Russell, he went through a lot of trauma as well. If you don't know Russell Williams, he was a spiritual teacher who I was friendly with here in Manchester, England, who died 2 years ago at the age of 96. And he didn't publish any books until 3 years before his death. He published his first book, which I helped him to write his first book. But he was a very intensely awakened person. And it was partly because of the trauma he went through in his childhood and during the Second World War, but also for the years he spent caring for horses. So yeah, a lifestyle of spiritual practice, whether it's conscious spiritual practice or unconscious spiritual practice, can also lead to an awakening. Sometimes it's a combination, as with Russell, a combination of some degree of suffering, some degree of spiritual practice, working together, maybe even with some degree of natural wakefulness. They can all work together to bring about a shift into a wakeful state.
But in a nutshell, Steve, I believe that there's a mystery there.
Maybe. Maybe it's, there's some aspects of it that we can't really rationalize or explain. But, okay, thank you, Jorge. Nice to meet you. Let's go to a different person. Lydia, maybe? Can we hear you, Lydia?
Hi. Thank you, Steve, for that. Couple of questions, if you don't mind. Hopefully they're both quite quick. One is, having read your book, The Fall, when you're talking about an awakening, do you think you're talking about not so much an evolution as going back to how we should have been anyway? Mm-hmm. And then my other question is just whether you've noticed a sex difference, like a difference between men and women and how they go through these awakenings.
Good questions. So first of all, I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of going back and a bit of going forward. Mm-hmm. So it's going back to recapture the natural wakefulness of indigenous peoples and prehistoric human beings. That natural sense of connectedness to nature, that communal feeling where the individual is not so significant. The environment and the community are as much a part of our identity as our own individual being. And that sense of sacredness. So indigenous peoples have this sense of sacredness that we've lost, the sense that the whole of the world is imbued with a spiritual force. There's so many indigenous groups had a term for a spiritual force which was present in everything, which brought everything into oneness. But in my book, The Fall, I suggest that we lost that through the development of our intense sense of ego, which is what I call the fall. The fall is the development of the intensified sense of ego. And I think prehistoric peoples obviously had an ego too, but our ego became much more intense, much more separate from our own bodies and separate from our surroundings, separate from other human beings. Well, there was a positive side of that. The positive side of that was that we developed a new kind of intelligence, not a new kind of intelligence, but a more intense, abstract way of thinking, logical thinking, more technological, a more technological way of thinking. We developed philosophies, psychologies and sciences and so on. So that was a positive side of the fall, this new kind of heightened intellectual ability. So I think what's happening now is that we are recapturing the sense of connectedness, the sense of natural wakefulness of prehistoric peoples, but also we're combining it with our new logical, intellectual intelligence. We're integrating them together. So that's why it's different. It's a combination. It's an integration rather than a complete return, if you like. And the second question. What was your second question? I've forgotten now.
Whether you'd noticed really a difference in the way that men and women go through this.
I have to a degree. In my research, I found that women are more likely to report these transformational experiences. You know, by quite a significant margin, by about 2/3 to 1/3. But who knows why that is? Is it that the question I can't really answer is that because women are more likely to come forward and tell people about these experiences, or is it kind of more fundamentally that women are more likely to undergo these experiences? I'm not sure. You know, I can't really answer that. So at the moment, it's a bit of an open question, but certainly women seem to be more likely to, you know, report these experiences. I mean, if anybody's got any views on that, are women literally fundamentally more to have these experiences? I don't know.
Well, I think that women probably find it easier to talk about things, so that could be part of it.
Yeah.
Eckhart Tolle says that women are naturally closer to enlightenment than men. Because women have a kind of softer sense of ego.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So you might expect the effect to be bigger for men. And if it's post, you know, if it's post something like going to prison, then more men go to prison. So you might expect to find more men in that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. Interesting point. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
How about should we go to Julie now? Are you there, Julie?
Sorry. Hi. I was just interested on your view. You mentioned a kind of perfect self that's there, kind of waiting to come forth. And just in terms of like addiction, I've had like instant release from like a compulsion to drink.
Oh yeah.
In terms of traumatic psychosis, my personal experience, sorry, I've had immense healing take place by a connection to something spiritual within those that I don't think I could have got anywhere else. But I've never had like full healing from kind of, you know, psychological patterns, developmental trauma. And if there's this perfect self that can kind of just come forth, I wonder, is it your view that that can happen, like a full psychological healing? And then also, if that is your view, have you met any kind of examples of that?
Good question. Well,
and if so, how? No.
Right.
But no.
Well, yeah, it's very unusual for somebody to undergo a complete purification. Even though people feel as if they are reborn, they have a new sense of identity, sometimes patterns remain. Sometimes the process of spiritual awakening brings up material that's been repressed, as we mentioned earlier. So it can be quite a difficult process. You know, this is what we mean when we talk about spiritual crisis, is that sudden spiritual awakening, sudden spiritual opening can be quite disturbing. You know, it can be mistaken easily for psychosis in extreme cases. And I think, you know, when a new self is born, it's a bit like a birth. You know, it's a birth, physical birth is quite a traumatic process for the baby and for the mother sometimes. And, you know, that sudden emergence of something so powerful and so new, it can be very disruptive to the whole organism, both in physiological and psychological terms. So a lot of people report disturbances in memory and concentration, strange physical symptoms, inability to sleep, strange energies that seem to rush through you, and so on. and also a kind of hypersensitivity where you feel as if you're being bombarded with material that you don't really understand. Because suddenly you've opened up, suddenly your boundaries have fallen away, and suddenly all of this material is bombarding you. And it's not just material from the outside, it's also from inside too, because you've opened up inside, and material that you've, maybe memories or traumatic experiences that you've repressed, emerge inside you. So, you know, it's sometimes, well, often not an easy process. Even though I found in my research that eventually, even if it takes several years or longer, it always settles down eventually. It's like a process. It's like I think of it as an earthquake in incredibly slow motion. If you looked at an earthquake in incredibly slow motion, you know, you'd see the ground slowly settling again after this incredible disturbance. So it's like that, you know, the ground slowly settles, even if it takes years, and the process works itself out, even if it takes years. So an integration always occurs in the end. Well, that's what I found in my research. Other people may have found, you know, may have had different findings. But there are some cases where people emerge in a very pure way, without any of the baggage, without any disturbance or any baggage. That's quite unusual, but I have met, you know, quite a few people who've undergone that. I guess the best example is Eckhart Tolle. He's a very good example of somebody who went through extreme suffering, underwent a sudden rebirth. And he was quite confused for a long time, but he's kind of this kind of stable sense of well-being, which remained. He didn't have too many disruptive experiences. So it is possible, but it's quite unusual, I think.
Yeah, it's hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Yeah.
Anybody else with a hand up? There's Shuli. Shuli? Are you there, Shuli? I think maybe, is your microphone on mute? Or maybe it's at a low volume? Okay, well maybe, oh, is that you, Shuli? Hi. I can hear you. You're quite faint, but I can hear you.
I'll just put my headphones in, probably easier. How about now?
Oh, that's better.
Yeah. Hi. So it's really interesting what you've been talking about, because this is kind of my intro into, oh, this is actually a thing that I'm experiencing. It's like a phenomenon. I'm interested to know about, so you talked about the wakefulness state where you sort of stay awake after your awakening versus a short kind of period. And I actually had like my Phoenix moment 2 weeks ago. So I'm very, very connected right now, and I'm feeling great. Although everything you just described before, like all the information, can't sleep, like just loads going on. But I'm like a bit worried that this is actually, I already thought I had my awakening. I thought I went through the dark night of the soul. I thought I had the rebirth, and then I got plunged into even like beyond anything. So I just came out of like 6 months of intense darkness with my shadow, suicidal, like everything had fallen away. Like there was a lot of trauma as a result of my initial awakening, because I lost my career, I lost my friends, I lost my family, everything was like totally like just pulled from beneath me, basically, after having all these realizations of what my purpose is and integration and da 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 da. So now I'm like, oh god, this is like the second level. Is this going to continue for the rest of my life, where I'm plunged into this horrible dark space, and then I'm re-emerging, because it's like twice now, and it's really disruptive. Let's just say.
Yeah, it's that's kind of the unfair thing about spiritual awakening, is that it's often preceded by suffering. It's often followed by suffering. Spiritual crisis can trigger an awakening, and the spiritual awakening can trigger the crisis. But I think what you know, as I said to Julie just now, I think it was Julie, that it is a process. You know, spiritual awakening is very dramatic, and it can be very dramatic. And when it's dramatic, it's often very disruptive. And it's bound to be disruptive because it's such a major shift in our organism, both physiologically and even physically. It's a major shift. So it's bound to have disruptive symptoms, just like an earthquake. You know, it destroys buildings, it uproots everything. But it's a process. The thing to be aware of is that it's a process which works itself out. So the important thing is to be aware that it's temporary, you know, and it's important to be mindful of it, to observe the process without being carried away by it. And if you can maintain a kind of a witnessing perspective, then you'll observe the process work itself out, and you'll be less immersed in the disruptive symptoms of the process. You'll be aware that the witnessing part of you is not actually involved in the process. It observes the process without being completely immersed in it. So that's one thing, that it's a temporary process which you can witness. And another thing is that, you know, you can actually, there are a lot of measures you can undertake to minimize the disruptive symptoms. Are you familiar with the Spiritual Crisis Network?
I heard of it.
Yeah, I'd recommend.
I contacted someone from there. It was a period last year where I was just like desperately seeking help from every avenue possible, and I couldn't actually like make anything happen. I just didn't have the stability to actually secure that support.
Oh, well, maybe now you're in a better position to secure it. But yeah, even if you just go to their website, they have a lot of very sensible advice about how to minimize the disruptive symptoms in terms of diet. You know, you can follow a certain diet. In terms of spending a lot of time in nature, you know, in very quiet surroundings, living a fairly quiet life, maybe taking time off work if necessary. And yeah, so I'd recommend, you know, or maybe contacting somebody from the Spiritual Crisis Network. So, you know, but at the same time, be aware that it is a process. You know, you've undergone a big shift. So that shift it's bound to have caused some disturbances, like every shift causes disturbances. But those disturbances are just temporary. They'll work themselves out. And eventually, you know, you will emerge in a state of new integration, you know, and stability. So yeah, trust in the process and trust in your own ability to witness the process.
I do have a second question if we have time. So for me personally, it was very like out of nowhere. I wasn't at all engaged in spirituality. I'm actually trained as an epidemiologist. So I do public health research. That's been my thing, and I'm really interested. I mean, like consciously, I was a total skeptic, totally closed, only evidence-based medicine. But subconsciously, I went to study indigenous health in Australia. I've been working. My interest is in people who inject drugs. So it's all kind of underlying interest, but not consciously aware that I was a spiritual being. It was more like the observer. So now anyway, I'm like trying to, like, my mind is always constantly thinking about like research and public health, especially now. And yeah, I think like because of the way I've been trained, I was never told about any of these studies happening about spirituality. Even I've worked in a mental health research institute and there was nothing. So my question is about how seriously does the mainstream public health academia take the research that's related to spirituality?
Good question. I think it's beginning to take it seriously. I think it's an after effect of the popularity of mindfulness. You know, there's been a lot of research on mindfulness over the past 10 years. And it's kind of one result of that is that there's a much more open-mindedness towards spirituality. So I think, over the last few years, there was a new openness. 2 years ago, I had an article published in The Psychologist, which is like the mainstream psychology journal in the UK. read by all the conventional psychologists. And I published an article on awakening experiences in there. And I got a great response. I thought I'd get a lot of responses from people saying, this is not psychology. You're not a psychologist. Get out of here. But actually, there was a great response. You know, people were very interested and very open-minded. So yeah, I think it's an emerging area, you know, research into spirituality, into unusual state of consciousness. So yeah, it's quite exciting in a way that there was this new openness. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Shall we got time for a couple more questions? Alessandro, are you there? Can you hear us, Alessandro? I think you are muted, actually. Shall I maybe. Can you unmute yourself?
Hey, hi.
Oh, hi.
That was my 8 years old daughter. Here it is. Her name is Eliza. And she really wanted to hear about you. So that I was explaining her what you were talking about.
Hello.
I really love your books. Thank you so much. So very good.
Oh,
I have a question. So I really truly believe that as a child, or as far as I can remember, I was really awakened. And it's always been like that since like in my childhood. And then since it was giving me a very hard time, like in my life and with other people, eventually I kind of gave up on it, you know, and then I had like a very normal non-awakened life for many years. And at some stage I had people telling me, why do you think so much? It was always in the mind. And this is what like until I was 40. And then by chance, I ended up reading your books and doing spiritual practice. And now I'm kind of going back on it. And I'm having like temporary experiences. Sometimes after a day or the last two. And the question is, I would like to understand, like, is this a pattern that you observed somewhere? Does it make sense? Or it's just I made it all up?
Well, you mean the pattern of you re-engaging with spirituality and having experiences?
Yeah, meaning like I think I'm positive that I was awakened as a child.
Yeah.
Many years, and then I came back.
Yeah, I think that is a pattern. Yeah, I think in many ways children are naturally awakened. Young children especially have a natural spiritual wakefulness. You know, they have the same presence which exists in the spiritually awakened state. They have the same sense of connection to nature. They have the same sense of joyousness which emerges in spiritual awakening. I think all young children have this natural spiritual awakening, natural spiritual wakefulness. It usually fades away as we become adults, partly because our egos begin to develop. It's partly due to social conditioning. You know, our cultures don't really support spiritual awakening. So it usually fades away as we become adults. So I think when we return to spiritual practice when we are older, in a sense, we may reconnect with our natural childhood wakefulness, which is probably still inside us in some sense, behind the ego, you know. It's obscured by the ego, but it's always there naturally deep down inside us. So maybe we are reconnecting with that childhood wakefulness. So that's, yeah, I think it is quite a common phenomenon, I think. Yeah.
Okay,
good. Yeah, it's
that's very good to know.
You know, we have so much to learn from children. You know, I think of children as higher beings. You know, we need to learn from children, young children.
Just over many years, I felt like I couldn't quite fit with the other kids because they weren't just like that. They lasted like until I was probably 13 or so, and then eventually plainly give up and changed. So that's like it's strange for me that then I've been off it like 30 years and then it's coming back.
Yeah, I think maybe it's partly to do with cultural conditioning too, because if you want to succeed, if you want to follow a profession in our societies, you sometimes have to repress your innate spirituality because it's so kind of unsupported in our normal social environment. You can't go to work and talk about your spiritual experiences. You know, you can't sort of pause in your business meetings to meditate. It's just not socially acceptable. So many people end up repressing their natural spirituality because it's not acceptable. So maybe eventually when we are older, that repression begins to undo, and there's a new sense of acceptance of our innate spirituality.
I see. That's a very good answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, yeah, nice to meet you.
I hope
Nice
we
to
can
meet
do
your
that.
daughter too.
Bye, take care.
Bye. So I got a note here saying Emily wants to ask a question. Oh no, Emily says her question was answered. Is that right? But feel free, Emily, if you want to ask a different question.
Well, Steve, I think there's Niam. Is it someone at the very start asked a question?
Oh yeah, I didn't see that.
Nave.
Yeah.
Where is it? Is he still here? Is it Niam? Is he still here?
Leanne's.
Niam, is it?
I can't see somebody with a hand up called Leanne's. Oh, is that? There's Gino. Gino, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Steve. Hey, I'm in this area as well too, and looking at a lot of these anecdotes that you have of these reports of people, I'm just curious: have you developed, after looking at so many, have you developed kind of a metaphysics or a metaphysical framework around all of this? For me, I've noticed there are a lot of people that have that kind of awakening that you talk to, and they reconnect to the innate joy of being, you know, gratitude for everything and action from that. But then there's another group that they pop and then they get downloads, or they start developing abilities. So different forms of knowing, people that can then do energy healing, or they start seeing auras, this kind of thing. You know, have you, what's your metaphysics around all of this? That's the first one. And the second one, very quickly, is looking at it physiologically. Have you also compared the work of, like, there's a guy named James Hart that has this biocybernaut that have got EEG readings of people going through awakening, or people like Zoran Josifovich at NYU that are looking at neural states of, or even Peter Fenwick in London that are studying people in this area as well too. So two-parter. One is the metaphysics, and for me, I've noticed there are these bottom-up people that can be grounded, but then these top-down people that get downloads and say, "Hey, I have to do this."
Yeah, well, what I found is that there are many different characteristics of wakefulness. In my book, The Leap, I think I highlight 22 different characteristics of wakefulness, and I sort them into 4 different categories. If I remember, there are perceptual characteristics, affective characteristic, the way it feels inside, conceptual characteristics, and the way that people understand the world, understand themselves. And the 4th one, what was the 4th one? I can't remember. But there are 22 different characteristics. And I found that people tend to emphasize certain characteristics over others. So there may be certain people who are more perceptually orientated. So to them, the main aspect of their wakefulness is how vivid the world seems, and how beautiful the world seems, and how connected they feel, how everything seems interconnected. For other people, it may be the intersubjective aspect, the sense of compassion that they feel, the sense of altruism, the sense of empathy, the sense of connection to other people. So that may be more emphasized. But for other people, it may be the inner affective aspects, you know, the kind of inner quietness, the inner stillness, the inner joy that they feel, or maybe the kind of visions or the psychic powers that they may develop. Those aspects may be more pronounced. So it varies from person to person. There's a whole set of different characteristics which vary. Most of them are present. All of them are usually present to some degree, but some are emphasized to a greater degree. Maybe just because of innate personality characteristics. It's difficult to say. But on the basis of those characteristics, I developed a scale of spiritual wakefulness, which you can check out at the back of my book, The Leap. And that kind of summarizes all of these different characteristics. And, you know, ideally, it should give you an idea of the different areas where your awakening is strongest or more developed or more emphasized and so on. But it gives you a kind of overview of all of the different characteristics. And the second question, that's not really an area that I've looked into, you know, the kind of the brain scanning aspects of wakefulness, the brain activity which is involved in wakefulness. To me, it's not really so significant. I think the brain activity is really just a map, but the territory itself is the experience of awakening. So I'm more interested in the experiential side. But I think it's, you know, it is very useful to, if you could examine the brains of spiritually awakened people or of people who are undergoing awakening experiences. And if you could kind of establish how their brains function differently to other people, then that would be very interesting. But, you know, I'm not really sure whether it's, you know, to what degree it's possible. Brain activity seems to vary so much. Even if you look into depression, for example, you know, there's no guarantee that people who are depressed have the same kind of brain activity. It seems to vary a lot according to different people. So it's an interesting area, but it's not one that I'm personally following so much myself.
There are signatures, just real quickly, and part of the challenge for the people that are scanning the brains is identifying the subjects and being able to validate them in some way. And so hooking, you know, the collection, the database of people that you have that you've studied, you know, with groups that are studying the brain may be really interesting.
Yeah.
And then also looking at the intersubjective between people, especially eye contact for that is really quite fascinating. Happy to discuss that offline with you. We do those kind of studies here in Hong Kong.
Oh, really? Interesting. Yeah, it's a very interesting area. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? I think the last question's from, I need my glasses on. Satyin Taylor? Satyin Taylor, are you there?
I am, yes. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm being told by my wife to be quiet, so waking the baby. I just wanted to make a point and see if you agree. So in the early days of the Spiritual Crisis Network, we kind of had only one party line, that we declined to engage in the differential diagnosis between spiritual emergency and psychosis. And I think we had some success in challenging people like David Lookoff that it was an unhelpful differential. So I'm kind of really reluctant to myself. I'm happy to hold, from my own experience, the label of psychosis as long as I'm allowed a parallel, you know, differential, parallel to the transpersonal diagnosis of spiritual emergency. And it's my experience in SEN groups working in mental health that it is just much more messy. It's both and, not either or. So that I don't know if you're following my I'm saying. So I mean, I'm just curious if you buy into the, you know, in the old Groff books, the differential diagnosis chart for saying this is spiritual emergency, this is psychosis. I think that's very dated and unhelpful. Actually, it writes off a lot of the psychological processes and the emotions that get reduced into the label of psychosis.
Yeah, I'm aware of the debate about it. You know, I've read Stan Groff. He does differentiate between psychosis and spiritual awakening or spiritual emergency. I don't really have a settled opinion about it. I think, you know, the main obstacle to spiritual awakening is the normal self system, the normal self system of the ego, with all its structures and all its filters and all of its processes. You know, there are many people who have a very healthily functioning ego, which allows them to be successful and to live happy lives in normal society. And that's fine, but the normal self system doesn't really allow for the possibility of spiritual wakefulness, because there is a certain sense of duality in the normal self system. You are in here, the world is out there, you are separate from other people. And also there's a certain kind of familiarized perception which is associated with the normal self system. You know, we perceive a world which is familiar, mundane, normal. We don't really pay attention to our surroundings. We take the world around us for granted. We take other people for granted. So this is all associated with the normal self system. So when a person has an awakening experience, it usually happens because the normal self system fades away temporarily. And when somebody undergoes spiritual awakening, it's because the normal self system dissolves away and something replaces it. But I think that's true of psychosis too. In psychosis, the normal cell system is not functioning properly, or maybe it's dissolved away. And maybe some people who don't have the qualities of spiritual awakening because their normal self system has faded away and a new self system has not yet emerged to replace it. You know, I still think there's potential, there's spiritual potential. Whenever the normal self system fades away, there is always some spiritual potential. So I think with support and encouragement and with therapy and understanding, I think any state of psychosis has some spiritual potential.
Sorry.
Was it really that boring, my answer? Okay, well, yeah, so I'm kind of on the fence. I don't really have a settled view, but I think there is spiritual potential in whenever the normal self system fades away, even though it may lead to psychosis, I think there is spiritual potential, if that is a satisfactory answer. Okay, so it's 9:05 here in the UK, and I think it's time to draw this session to a close. But it's been really interesting for me. It's been really interesting for me to interact with you and to hear your comments and your questions and about your experiences. So I hope you found it an enjoyable encounter. I certainly have found it an enjoyable encounter. And hopefully we can keep in contact. You know, feel free to email me. Feel free to email me through my website. My website is, I'll type it in here actually, just so you can write it down if you want to make contact. You go to stephenmtaylor.com and you can just email me through the website if you want to stay in contact. And otherwise, yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening or your day and stay well. Hope you manage to flourish through these challenging times, and all best wishes and blessings.
Thank you, Steve.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Bye. You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Sorry about the yawning, Steve. I was tired.
No worries. It's quite late now.
Thanks for the presentation. Bye.